Hi, everyone. Welcome to our virtual town hall on blue-green algae. We are slowly seeing people coming on, so we'll give it a few seconds for everyone to get their audio and video sorted out.
And they stay on. Yep.
And yeah, we're going to ask everyone, please stay muted while we have the presentation. If you have a question, please raise your hand. There's a feature at the bottom of your screen that says raise hand. If you raise your hand, we will acknowledge you, and I will go ahead and ask you to unmute yourself, or I will go ahead and unmute you and you can ask your question at that time. We're going to have a brief presentation. It's going to be about 20 minutes. And then we will have another about 20 minutes of just questions. So as the presentation is ongoing, feel free to start thinking about anything you'd like to ask. And just wanted to introduce Mark Perry, our CEO here at Florida Oceanographic. And we also have Todd Thurlow, who's an attorney. He's also a Rivers Coalition board member. And with that, take it away, Mark.
Great. Welcome, everybody. I'm glad you could join us for this virtual town hall. We're excited to have Todd Thurlow with us. I've known Todd for many years, and in recent times, Todd's gotten very into helping us to monitor all the water quality situation, particularly in Lake Okeechobee, and how it affects us here in the coastal estuaries, particularly St. Lucie estuaries. So we're going to talk tonight about the blue-green algae impacts and their impacts on the estuary as well as Lake Okeechobee. So I'm gonna present a little and then turn it over to Todd, and we're gonna go back and forth and talk a little. So what is blue-green algae? Blue-green algae is, and what are the causes? What causes the blooms to happen? What are some of the impacts to our marine life and also to our human health impacts? And then what are some perhaps solutions of what they, or what we can do about it? So potentially the blue-green algae is a cyanobacteria, and it's commonly called blue-green algae because it looks kind of bluish green in color when it's on the surface. There are a lot of different kinds of blue-green algae. The dominant one that we are talking about is called Microcystis aeruginosa. And that's a scientific name, not to be confused, but when we hear about the toxin that it releases, it's called microcystis. And microcystin is the toxin that's released from this algae when it gets to a certain situation. So when it blooms so much. So usually these cyanobacteria or blue-green algae are always pretty common in water bodies all around the world, but in freshwater particularly, there are conditions that are right when they bloom. And when that happens, they just enumerate and they become so massive that they can be visual on the surface. They can move around with currents. And what causes the growth and the bloom in the blue-green algae is basically the nutrient-rich waters. Just like a plant, if you have fertilizer and you have warm temperatures and lots of sunlight, they respond accordingly. So these blue-green algae bloom and create these huge, massive blooms that end up in our water bodies and are very harmful to, of course, us and humans and animals that are exposed to them. So they are really caused by the nutrient inflows. And particularly when we look at Lake Okeechobee, like you're seeing here, and even from satellite imagery that we're going to show you and talk about, you'll see the massive algae blooms that cover great expanse of the lake. The agricultural runoff, primarily when we talk about nutrients like fertilizing these algae blooms, it's usually nitrogen and phosphorus. We get other runoff from other urban runoff or even septic tank runoff that could be concentrated and cause that. The warm temperatures in the water, usually in stagnant water conditions, lend themselves in a lot of sunlight. Lake Okeechobee in particular is vulnerable to this, and it's a freshwater condition that this algae occurs. So when you look at Lake Okeechobee discharges and our connection to the lake Okeechobee has been regulated and surrounded by a dike. And so the canals are built to release the water if the lake gets too high. And the concern we have, of course, is this historical management of the water levels in Lake Okeechobee and how they release the water to these coastal estuaries, particularly to the east to the St. Lucie estuary and to the west to the Caloosahatchee. So it transports with it not only the water, but of course what's in the water. And if it's the blue-green algae blooms, we have seen over the years that these algae blooms continue on over to our coast and can fill it up. Currently, right now, there are a lot of people that monitor the algae blooms. Of course, not only U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, but the Water Management District and the Florida Department of Environmental Protection and FWC and the Health Department. So there's a lot of agencies now that are monitoring where is the algae bloom, how extensive it is, how intense the bloom is, and how long it lasts. And so they're concerned about that. On the left-hand side, you see the cyanobacteria index, which is the satellite imagery that NOAA produces, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. And then on the right-hand side, you see the red tide monitoring. So we wanted to make sure we don't get confused between blue-green algae blooms and red tide. Red tide is a similar dinoflagellate organism that is similar to a bloom, and it can bloom particularly along the west coast of Florida. And sometimes when this particular red tide organism blooms, it gives off a toxin and can kill fish as well. So the agencies like FWC and the Corps, they monitor not only the blue-green algae blooms, but also that. So notice that today or yesterday, 19th, the big algae bloom covered about 240 square miles in Lake Okeechobee. Pretty intense bloom when you consider the entire Lake Okeechobee is about 730 square miles. So here's how the Water Management District on month to month, they show you comparisons to previous times, like in June of 2003, up in the upper left-hand corner, you can see that kind of bloom was real intense compared to July of this year when they were showing this particular images. They can compare it to what's going on right now. Again, the district monitors it, the Corps monitors it, and the district also reports out the sampling. So here what you see are these various sampling sites throughout the lake, and particularly 308 and S77, which contact the St. Lucie and the Caloosahatchee estuary. But you can see the intensity of the toxin in this column called toxin is the micrograms per liter. And put it simply, that anything over 8 micrograms per liter, 8 parts per billion, is going to cause harmful effects to humans, pets, and wildlife, and we shouldn't be near it, touching it, or ingesting it, obviously. In this case, the S308 sample was about 70 micrograms per liter, which is almost 10 times the the detectable limit there that has a problem. So I want to go to the Eye on Lake O website. Todd has been fantastic in putting this website together. And Todd, you just amaze me every time we talk about how you monitor not only just the blue-green algae blooms, but also the data for what's causing them, namely the nutrient inflows and stuff. So Todd, take us to your website here. I'm going to stop and let you kind of take on. Okay. So if you wouldn't mind.
All right, I'm going to get my screen up here. And so there we are at the same screen, but this is live on my website that anybody can go to at any time. As Mark said, I'm a lawyer. I just have learned this stuff honestly since around 2016 when Mark kind of roped me in or got me much more interested by asking me to help out. And so it kind of evolved into this website. So after going through the slides that Mark just went over, I'm going to hit a couple of those topics using the website, going into the causes, so we can look at that, the connections, and then look at a little of the history going back to 2016 when we got started with this. And then we can look at some of that chlorophyll and microcystin data that comes in every day from the DEP. So this is the main site, but what are the causes of the algae blooms? It's basically the nutrient runoff, like Mark said. This is a basin map of the Lake Okeechobee watershed, and it's colored by phosphorus concentration. And there's a certain target for the phosphorus concentrations and the loads going into the lake. And it's these loads and concentrations that cause the blooms. The lake is basically targeted to have a diet, I call it, a target of about 105 metric tons. And so Mark can tell you the numbers, but I think it's about 5 times that is what's been going into the lake.
Right.
And so zooming in on this map a little bit, here is our connection to the lake, the C-44 canal. So it starts up here at the S-308. And these arrows, by the way, you can pull this up on your computer at home, is a live flow map. So this is the live flow as of 6:03, about 40 minutes ago. And so as you can see, this arrow is white, which means there's no flow. There's no flow, thankfully, from the lake right now. And there's no flow. It looks like the S80 is there. There's no flow down at the S80. But this is, you zoom all the way in here, this is the infamous S80. These are the locks up here at the headwaters of the South Fork. So that's what transports anything that's coming from the lake into our St. Lucie estuary. So looking in more at connections, backing up to March, if you all remember, we had discharges in March. And there was a lot of discussion about that at the time because something that, and I'll show some slides from 2016. Things were much different in 2016 as far as operations. It seemed to be more of water's high, we're just going to discharge it. We're not really paying attention. And no one was looking at satellite imagery back then. And so this is in March, and you can see the S-308 is at 2612 CFS. We can get into what that is, but that's a lot of water. And so you got the gate open here, you got the gate open there, water's going into the St. Lucie. But what was the situation back then? So this is a graph that's on the site. If you go to this live data, it's in that link there. But these are the three pulses that we had back in March. So there's the water quality or the water quantity, the quantity of water going in at that time. But what was in it, or what did the lake look like? This is that HAB image in March. Doesn't look so bad. I mean, there's you can see some potential up here in the northwest part of the lake, but over here where S-308 is, luckily no potential at the gates. The water wasn't as bad coming in. I have other satellite imagery that I post. I usually only post these images if there's algae. So I did not post this image in March because it didn't show anything. So this is March. This is that, I'll show you some of these same images when we do have algae. So this is March. Lake looks pretty clear. Now let's go back to that graph of the pulses. These are the flows going out. So we get into July. What were we dodging by taking those earlier in the year discharges? This is what we looked like just a couple of months later.
This is
And
July,
so
right, Todd?
this is July 9th.
Yeah.
And so it's around July every year when the lake is kind of peaking in algae bloom season. Right. And so luckily in July, there's your S-308 right there. But the gates were closed. Yeah. But we had this massive bloom out on the lake. It's since subsided a little bit with all the clouds and the storms we've had come through here. It's kind of stirred things up and knocked the algae down. So timing and transport, we looked at that, the flow graph. So let's go back to the image, or so we looked at that. So let's look at 2016. In 2016 was a much different story. This is that same flow graph, which is on the site for 2016. As you can see, we were getting discharges pretty much the whole year. And so this is when Mark said we've known each other for a long time. We have known Mark since I was a kid. And he was doing a lot with my sister. But Mark, I was working more on historical imagery in Google Earth. And Mark gave me a call from Texas, and he emailed me a picture of the lake from NASA. And he said, Todd, measure this. Can you measure this in Google Earth? I said, certainly. So this is the image that started the whole website. I posted it because it was a large image, and I emailed it to my sister and Mark. but this was, 239 square mile bloom on the lake. There's your S308, and you saw the graph that we just looked at. We were
in
that
discharge.
time,
Yeah,
we were discharging 4,000 acre feet a day.
right.
So all that algae was just coming right through the gates. My sister and her husband were flying an airplane over there, taking pictures of the algae literally coming over the S80 gates. And so then we kind of repeated it again a couple years later in 2018. This is the HAB image in 2018 that you see a lot of, because it's probably one of the worst images since they've been doing HAB. I started doing these HABs actually before the district. We kind of forced them to start looking at those things.
Yeah.
You kind of notice on here too, it doesn't even have Ion Lake O. I hadn't even made the Ion Lake O website yet. It was still just on my law firm website. But yeah, that was 2018. So Mark, chime in if you, or anybody chime in if they have any
Yes.
questions.
So there was a lot, as you can see, piled up next to 308, but all over the lake. So as it got discharged through, again, they were discharging it. So this had started some time ago. Remember, even we started seeing them come into the St. Lucie estuary back in 2004, 2005. But we've documented, it especially started what they call the lost summer of 2013. So 2013, 2016, 2018, these were major bad years for the discharges that carried with it all this harmful algal bloom into the St. Lucie estuary. So again, that connection is there, as Todd's demonstrating. We're very concerned because the lake being so high right now at about 14 feet elevation, that they could say, well, we're getting too high, we need to discharge. And there's, about 240 square miles of harmful algal blooms in the lake right now. But getting back to like this, what Todd's talking about, these are also an overlay of all those dots, right, Todd, of the concentrations that
This is the
FTP,
microcystin
right,
data that comes in. Mark had that slide up from the district. They'll show it at their monthly meetings, but that's a month, and then a lot of times the at least the district's readings don't come in for several weeks. The DEP posts their results daily.
yeah,
And so this page on my website grabs those daily readings. It only shows the last 30 days. So right before this meeting, I changed 30 to 60 just because actually right now it's not so bad. It's better. But last month it was pretty bad in some spots. So looking back 60 days, yeah, these dots, you can click on them. And so here's our S308. We click on this dark dot. They're colored by concentration. And by the way, there's a legend here. So if I pop the legend up, it'll show you that those are, like 800 times potentially the target. Just pull this one up. So this is the bad 480 micrograms per liter. And this is microcystin at the S308. Now that's in a very concentrated single spot. And this is the whole history. And if you all can't see that, I can zoom that in a little bit.
but as we're saying, right, Todd, that over eight micrograms per liter is toxic to humans. And
yeah, I set my color
there's a
target
yeah
at 8 because that's what there's no set target for that. There's no rule or law in Florida on that, but the consensus that I see with the federal EPA is
when US EPA came out with that back in 2019, we tried to get the state to adopt that standard, and they haven't done that. So at our end of our program, we're talking about getting EPA to demand that the state adopt that eight micrograms per liter standard. I'm glad you have a photo there, Todd. That's what it looks like right at the
and so everybody can look at this, because when you click on these dots, because this is coming from the DEP, when you click on these dots, it'll show you the history of that station, and you see all the photo links. So there's that 480, and you click on the photo, it'll show you what it looked like that day when they took that sample.
It's been called green guacamole, I think.
Yeah, that Mark had pointed out that the 70 sample that was in the district's monthly report, you can see here that was on July 8th.
Yep.
And if you look at that photo, that's what it looked like on July 8th. This is out at S308. So again, going back to the map, they're right here up at the lake. That's what you're seeing in that photo.
And what we're saying is it's on the lake side, not in the canal at this point, but sometimes when they open the locks for the boats, it will allow some of that to come into the canal right inside there. But then they monitor that as well inside the structure.
Yeah, so you can see the monitoring that's done on the inside. And even in the last 60 days, they're all in the green.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty good
Yeah.
indicator, but it's 0.94.
0.94. So it's, but again, even though it's not toxic, it could be. And this is what we're concerned about. If that built up, and as we've seen it build up in marinas like Pahokee Marina or other marinas, and it gets more and more toxic as it breaks down. And so we're real concerned if it builds up even in the lake or in places like that, and people get exposed to it, it could be very, very toxic, even though that sample doesn't show it as toxic. So the whole cue here is if you ever see it, we've got to report it and make sure it's tested, but stay away from it. That's really, really dangerous. Kind of back to this loading, again, the nutrient loading, we've been working also on the watershed. That colored area you see represents about 3 million acres of watershed to Lake Okeechobee, which means that all that, everything on that land that's within that 3 million acres is shedding off into the Kissimmee Valley that goes down into the lake. So the elevation of the land up at Kissimmee and upper chain of lakes in the north end of that is about 60 feet. And the lake is down at 14 feet, right? So it flows down into the lake, and they open these gates or have these gates open to allow that to flow into the lake. And so those are the numbers that you're looking at with those gates flowing in. And they may not be bringing toxic algae into the lake, but they're bringing nutrients, the phosphorus and nitrogen. And of course, you combine that with the sunlight and the warm temperature of the water, and all of a sudden now you've got a huge bloom in the lake. So that's great, Todd. Thank you for sharing that. Appreciate it. So we're going to go back kind of to Todd's website in a bit, and we can always go back there, but I want you to kind of get an idea of that so that we can continue to share his website. But when we talk about monitoring these sites, what are those impacts that come into the estuaries? Particularly, we've seen health and human impacts with posting of signs. Are you exposed to blue-green algae? These show up in Cleveland Clinic and other places and on the outside in the water body. But all they are is warning that you may be exposed to this and you may inquire symptoms. And if it's ingested or inhaled, and even pets have died from it in ingesting it, long-term effects could be, ALS or other things from the BMAA, which is in the toxic algae. The environmental impacts are obvious. It's killing our oyster reefs, seagrass beds, and near-shore coral reefs. And then, of course, the economic impacts. And at the bottom of the screen are all the years that we've kind of documented that these blue-green algae blooms from Lake Okeechobee have come into the estuary. So there are efforts to try to mitigate the problem or treat the problem. We believe the best way is to treat it at the source of the problem, which would be, and so does the Blue-Green Algae Task Force. They have advised the state to stop the nutrients from coming into the lake. So the LOSM, the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual, is an improved way to manage Lake Okeechobee, which they just adopted on August 12th. So now the Corps of Engineers and the district have this new schedule, and it considers very carefully if there are algae blooms in the lake and they don't have to discharge into the estuaries. They're going to be very mindful of that.
So Mark, to reiterate that point that I brought up earlier, if the lake over the past 5 years has averaged 26 metric tons of phosphorus into the St. Lucie watershed, just by implementing LOSM alone, and not necessarily building anything, but just by managing the lake differently, if we can bring those discharges down to zero in a year, that brings the load from the lake obviously down to zero too, because there's no water coming in.
Yeah, good point.
That's a 41% reduction in phosphorus right there.
Yep. And
Of the diet, I guess we call it.
Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
41% of what's totally coming in, but
Right. So to keep the algae off the diet, that's great. Then the BMAPs are called Basin Management Action Plans, and the BMP's Best Management Practices. These are efforts by the State Department of Environmental Protection and Department of Agriculture to try to implement ways to stop and reduce these nutrients from getting in the watershed. But they apparently haven't been real effective, particularly in Lake Okeechobee watershed, because even recent reports show about 500 or to almost to 1,000 metric tons a year coming into the lake, which as Todd mentioned, should only be around 105 metric tons a year. So we've got a long ways to go to implement any kind of regulation through BMAPs or BMPs to get the nutrients to stop. And of course, climate change impacts are happening. Long-term effects of the warmer water temperatures really help to exacerbate the algae blooms as well. There are a lot of resources that we're going to send you. I think, Valentina, we're also going to send them a copy of this so they can get these resources. Again, the Ion Lako website that Todd's presented is just fantastic. The Blue-Green Algae website from Florida DEP, and of course, the Blue-Green Algae Task Force are really good as well. So we think a good thing, a good action plan is to, we've initiated the action to get EPA, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, to ask to make sure that Florida, the state of Florida, adopt that standard for cyanotoxins in the state of Florida, that eight micrograms per liter. Because until they adopt that as a water quality standard, they can do all the reporting and monitoring and reporting they want, but it doesn't adopt it as a water quality standard that says if you exceed that standard, you are in violation of the water quality standards for the state. So we're trying to get them to adopt that as a standard. You can scan this with your phone as a QR code, and it'll take you right to the letter that you can add some of your own words into that goes directly to the administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So we're asking people maybe to take some action here, take this up on your site, and even visit our website for other action alerts or sign up for them. Valentina, right? We can get people to sign up for action alerts.
Yeah, so it's super easy. If you just pick up your phone and open your camera app, then you point it towards the QR code and a link will come up. You can click on that link and it'll take you directly to our website, which will allow you to send a letter to the EPA. And we've had hundreds of people so far do this. So we're hoping that everyone tonight can do it as well and help us out, get the word out, ask the EPA. My contact information is on here. So if you have any questions that don't go answered tonight, feel free to email me and I will do my best to answer your questions. But if you have any questions whatsoever right now, I invite you to raise your hand and I will call people and ask them to unmute themselves and we can have a conversation a little bit more about blue-green algae. Oh, I see John. Go ahead, John.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
First of all, Mark, thank you for doing this. I think one of the points about doing this town meeting is the actual data is available from Todd. It's not available from other places. And that's what's so important about what's going on here. And I continue to stress this. And I wish and I hope that we will continue these meetings because we can develop big picture ideas about what to do on actual data. So I just had to add that comment.
Great.
Speaking up.
Thanks, John. That, like the whole purpose of my site was to make the data more easily accessible, because it actually is. It's all online, but I had a background in computers. I'm kind of good at digging into these websites and finding these things, and then rather than showing people how to go get it, which sometimes changes daily because they're constantly changing these things. Just like I was saying, it started with that 2016 satellite image. And once I figured out how to go get the images every time the satellite went by, I found it easier just to post it somewhere where people could go grab it and take it from there. And so it started with the satellite imagery, but the data is out there too. the district and the Army, the district especially, the Army Corps has their data, but the district has a massive amount of water quality data on their site. And then that one basin map that I was showing that has all the basin information is in an annual report that they issue every year, but it's buried on a table that's on page 355 of a 1,000-page report. And so that's, those are some highlights of those reports. So it's very important to take those things out and get them in the open. And so I have to thank another guy, Gary Goforth, who used to be very involved with the Florida Oceanographic. He is the one that I got together years ago to first start doing those basin maps. And because, of course, I didn't understand this stuff at all. So it's been a way for me to learn it. And if I can learn it, I'll post it so other people can go get it. And if it's easier to go get it, like the flow data thing, that's coming right off. I'm pulling the data right off their site, but a heck of a lot easier to click on a map.
Fantastic.
So my message to you, Todd, if you can hear me, is thank
Certainly.
you. And let's do
Certainly.
more of this, please.
And that's what makes me want to do it. I mean, when people say they use it, I'm like, okay, good, because that's what it's all about. And it's educating having an educated public and also having an educated electorate to, because the rubber meets the road with the politics. We have to understand this stuff. And the other very confusing thing is all the units, CFS and micrograms per liter and parts per billion. I can't keep that stuff straight. So my cheat sheet for myself is my own website. And so if people ask me something, I'm like, I don't know, let's go in and go see about it. And there's a couple calculator tools and stuff on there too to help people get a understand.
It's great. It's great. Thanks, John.
And John, I think you're an attorney, right?
Yeah. Yes, he is.
So for us attorneys, and I can share the screen real quick if you want to say it, but like that basin map thing, I of course have to have my footnotes, right? Like we're doing a law review article. So if you go into the basin map, there's a thing off to the side that says target notes. And that's my note to myself, but it's also for people like John or anybody else that wants to click on that thing. It explains why I picked the color, and it has a link to either the FDEP report or the Florida Administrative Code section that spells out the different levels that we're basing those colors off of.
That's excellent. Yeah. Really thorough job. I think we have Gabby. Gabby,
Yeah, Gabby, I see you have your hand raised, so I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, thank you. Very informative talk. I'm in the Central Florida area, and unfortunately, my basin's discharged to you all. My question really is about the human health impacts. The DEP, the FWC, and the FDACs. What about the Florida Department of Health? How are they interacting with this? Because I don't see, they make a press release, they put up a sign, but that's as far as it goes. There should be something with them. Have you experienced that yet?
Yes, Gabby, that's a good point. And what's happened is they've, when the Blue-Green Algae Task Force was formed by the governor back in 2019, those scientists got together. That one of the first things they said was, how do we notify people about it? And how do we, let people know about the health risks and things? And it really involved trying to find out how the Florida Department of Health, and through their local chapters, like at county chapters, and how they go out and put notices out there to either a step-in sign or a poster like we showed, how do they let people know? And it's really through those step-in signs that you see out at the lake or nearby water bodies that says, you may be exposed to this harmful algal bloom, so there may be health effects. But the health department, they're on the calls, every weekly calls or the monthly calls that we have with all the other agencies, and they report just like the DEP does. Here's where we see it, here's where it is, and it could have these effects. But they're not getting down to specifically, well, what's their role as the Florida Department of Health in protecting the citizens of Florida from being exposed and the problems with the algae.
Yeah,
So
Mark, what I find, I mean, part of what I'm doing on my site is I'm every day, like I said, these locations of this data change, or they update the way they display their data. And I'm constantly looking on the lookout for another, water quality database that I can plug into to automate these maps. And so I find that the Department of Health, they're not doing at least in their reports, they're not doing the microsystem stuff. They're not doing the algae stuff, but they're doing the water quality as it is for and helping out, because you're the scientist, the basically sewage that's in the water. It's the organisms. What are the reports that they do, Mark?
well, they
It's,
do bacterial counts, like fecal
Yeah, like
coliform counts and
coli, yeah. So they
Enterococcus,
have
yeah.
those.
Mhm.
I was ready to make a map on those also, but of
Yeah.
course they're not in a very easy format to dig up and redisplay. But they have a website that has those results on it.
And again, if we get the US EPA to tell the state of Florida to adopt the standard, then Department of Health will have to use that standard as well as Department of Environmental Protection. So by getting EPA to get Florida to use the 8 micrograms per liter will set that standard. But what Todd's explaining is the Department of Health has been focused on, beach closures or closing a certain water body because of the high levels of bacteria. And those bacteria, particularly Enterococcus and other bacteria, come from the sewage outfall. So if there's a sewage problem or a problem in a local water body or along a beach, for instance, then they will post a closure of that beach or that water body because of the high levels of bacteria that people could causes a health risk. But they're not focusing on this harmful algal blooms as much as Todd mentioned. Colleen, I think you have your hand up in question?
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you. I am from New Smyrna Beach, and I've often felt really sad when I look at Lake Okeechobee stuff. I have a friend that lives in Siesta Key, and last January they had to close their beach for a month. People were very ill from inhaling the impact of the blooms on their shoreline. I think about the health risks as was just questioned, but I guess I have two questions. One is about the impact on real estate, because I would think it would be in the best interests of our state not to let the property values dump down when these are chronically happening on shorelines. And then the second thing is, what is the onus and responsibility of the ag fields, which flood all their nutrient-rich fertilizers into the tribs that go into Lake Okeechobee? I think they're exempt with the Clean Water Act. I could be wrong about that, but I would think if they notice that people are going to develop neurological diseases and things like that, this is not playing games. These are really serious love canal kinds of illnesses. So where does responsibility lie, and what has been the impact on the economic tourism? I would imagine is horrible, but I could be wrong.
Well, let me take it. The first question was about the real estate values, and by experience, back in 2018, as recent as that, when we had these huge harmful algal blooms in the estuaries, as we know it around our part of the state, I'm sure New Smyrna Beach too, is waterfront property is one of the highest valued properties compared to inland properties.
Right.
And these waterfront properties, the real estate values were dropping, and they had to actually put in, I knew realtors were putting in contracts that had to check the box that the buyer recognizes they might be buying a land on polluted water body. And
Right.
of course that the contracts dropped right away and nobody would sign up. The real estate, crashed for a long time during those bloom times, of course. And
Right.
nobody wants to talk about that. But in 2015, actually, the Florida Realtors Association did a study in 2015 of both Martin County area and Lee County, and found that over almost $1 billion in total values had dropped whenever we get these harmful algal bloom impacts.
Right.
About 500 to 700,000 million on one coast, and almost the same 4 to 500 million on this coast. So about $1 billion total of drop in value. So that's from the realtors, people, the Florida Association of Realtors. So the second part of your question, or second part, was what about these long-term health effects and why, who is responsible? And it does get back to the watershed, and it gets back to the pollutants that are coming into the water body, state waters like Lake Okeechobee and the water in Kissimmee from the runoff. And we, as whether it's agriculture or urban runoff, we need to be responsible for that runoff. And we should, hold that runoff on the site. We should retain it, treat it before it runs off into the water body. And they've done that in certain areas, like for instance, the industry, the dairy industries that are northeast of Lake Okeechobee and Taylor Creek and Nubbin Slough area were one of the highest loadings of phosphorus and nitrogen into the system from dairy farms. And
Right.
we recognize that, and the agencies went in, worked with them, and made them with these special treatment ponds and treatment areas so that they could continue to do their farming, but they had to go through special treatment because honestly, the industry just didn't know that they were polluting so much. So now, as Todd brings
Yeah,
these
so
up,
I'm showing some of these
concentration.
tributaries and things
Yeah.
up around the dairy farms where the phosphorus loading is very high, or the
Right.
phosphorus concentrations. The loading might not be high because, like Mark said, if they have ponds and areas where they have to catch the water, that's the key, is not to let it go into the lake.
Yeah.
Right.
But on the economic side, when we had those algae blooms here on the St. Lucie, it wasn't just the real estate, but there were paddle boarding businesses that went completely out of business and never came back.
Yeah.
There was a lot of fishermen inshore who went out of business.
Fishing guides and stuff.
Growing up here in Stewart, I've always kind of been an offshore fisherman because the inshore was kind of meh. And so, but what people don't realize is, and this is where you get into economics. And I mean, I don't want to kind of get into the debates of, because all these are balancing people's stakeholders' interests. And, the big stakeholder is the sugar field south of the lake that,
Right.
in essence, are preventing the flow from going south. That's water quantity. Their nutrients are heading south, so they're not really heading our direction to the St. Lucie unless there's back pumping, which they don't have anymore. But out here in the St. Lucie Flats and the St. Lucie River, what's the economic benefits and burdens of, okay, if a crop yield is affected by certain levels of discharges or not discharges, that's an economic hit on a farmer. It's all economics. But if we have these discharges that completely wipe out the St. Lucie River's seagrass out here, that's where all the nurseries are for the offshore fish too. So like the offshore fishermen, need to be aware, and I think they are, of when we have these algae blooms and the Indian River Lagoon is hit hard and all our grass flats are gone. That's a massive economic impact on the whole state of Florida. And there's $1 you can put on that. And there's organizations that have done studies and have, economic studies. And that was my undergraduate degree in economics. They have these people, write their, that can be a tough thing to put a number on, but the numbers are big.
Yeah.
And when you compare it to the benefits for crop yield, it makes me wonder about the benefits and burdens of that.
Right.
But yeah,
Thank you,
these,
Colleen. Good.
when you go up to the latest station data in here, you can hit TP concentration, and these dots, just like when we're looking at the microsystem, I might clear the map so it's not in the way, but you can go into these little tributaries here. But this is a discharge coming into a canal north of the lake. 954 parts per billion. I don't know what that means, but the website will tell you that's 23.85 times the Lake Okeechobee target of 40.
Right.
And so there's a long way to go to clean that up. And the key is to not have the, in the water in the first place. Once it's in the water, one thing Mark and I didn't really talk about were all the various, facilities, the STAs and the reservoirs that are being built to try to clean the water. That's a whole nother discussion.
Yeah.
They're on here too.
Good questions. Yeah.
Can I ask him?
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah, Colleen, you're on mute. You're still on mute. Yeah.
I noticed PLANK in one of your toxin data graphs, which I think might stand for planktothrix, but I could be wrong about that. Is that what that stood for? Because that's an anatoxin and it has a different kind of toxin than microcystin, but I just wondered if that's also a problem or not really a problem.
There are the different toxins and different algae that are actually causing some saxitoxins and other toxins that are caused by blooms as well. Red tide, has different toxins from the dinoflagellates.
Right.
But we are focused microcystin
Just
aeruginosa because
microcystin.
the microcystin is
The
kind of the
dominant.
dominant one
Right.
in
Okay.
these freshwater areas that we're talking about.
Okay.
There's also spermopsin and other ones that create, like you're saying, cyanotoxins,
Right.
which are in general pretty difficult. Yeah,
Okay. Thank you.
but good. Andrew, that's Andrew. Andrew, you have a question?
Hi, yeah. So I was just curious because when you were talking about treatment, so is it fair to say then treatment is kind of an upstream issue, so to speak, meaning like unless treatment happens at the source as it goes then downstream, I mean, it's harder to control at that point, more or less? Because I mean, I've read like, for example, like adding beneficial bacteria, for example, that would sort of compete, with the algae could be a solution which doesn't seem as harmful to, whether a fish or otherwise. But I guess unless it's treated at the source, so to speak, it doesn't otherwise, it's not like there's just one group overseeing overall treatment. Is that fair or just?
Oh, absolutely. That's a great point. A great question is that, the agencies have actually treated these algae blooms where they are. Let's say in Pahokee Marina or other places, they've treated them with hydrogen peroxide. They've treated them with other kinds of treatments that try to either mechanically or chemically try to, kill the algae where it is. But where it shows up is not as good as if you treat it at the source of the problem, which will be upstream in where it originates. So as we're looking at this kind of map, you see some of these, the treatment of the phosphorus and nitrogen that Todd has up there. If you look south of the lake, they built these treatment marshes, these stormwater treatment areas. And
Right.
those are man-made marshes, if you will. They're very shallow water bodies with planted plants like sawgrass and other plants, and they basically put water in there and it absorbs, it takes up the nutrients. So when it comes out of the other side of the stormwater treatment area, the STA, it's much cleaner. And they've shown that they can reduce it from, let's say, 300 parts per billion down to 20 parts per billion. So
Yeah, so
yes.
yeah, here's STA 5.6, and you can see this is the intake side. Like if we actually flip over to the flow map will show you the flows. You see all the flow coming in this side, flow coming out that side. But if we go back to TP concentration, you can see the concentrations on the inflow side in the 400s.
Right.
And then you see the outflow sides 52,
yeah,
22. So that's success. That's making progress on treatment. But my point, I think, was not necessarily treating it at the source, but preventing the source from entering the system in the first place. Yeah. And so in those upper basins, that's where the best management practices are the debate of how to reduce the loads by putting unnecessary amounts of phosphorus into the system to begin with. I'm sure someone's run the numbers or there's an economic study on it somewhere, but the costs, the cost savings of not having it go in the first place is hundreds fold dollars on the back end. Right. This STA 5.6 thing is hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to build. Yes. This is the big EAA reservoir that you hear about. This is the STA that's been in the news this week because they're doing an interim schedule on this thing. This thing is billions. These things are massive, size of Manhattan, and but so again, a lot cheaper. And and just think about it, they'll be more efficient if we can get the loads coming in the top lower then you
Right.
can run more water through them to get the same levels coming out the backside.
So if you zoom out a little bit, Todd, and see how it's relation to the EAA. So what we're talking about here is an example is those STAs are treating the water downstream from the basin runoff. So all of the Everglades agricultural area has basin runoff that go into those blue lines, the canals that have to go through the stormwater treatment areas before they go south into the Everglades. And what we're complaining about is that if that inflow water to the STAs were reduced by the source, which is the basin runoff from the Everglades agricultural area, primarily sugarcane, then it would be easier to treat that water. In fact, they should treat it up at the source. So if you go north of the lake, Todd, all the way north to the Kissimmee and those loadings that we see coming in, again, if they were to reduce their phosphorus and nitrogen loading from their land runoff into the water body at that source, we'd be a lot better off. These numbers would all be a lot less coming eventually into Lake Okeechobee. So that's the whole point. And Andrew, you bring that up very well, is that if we need to get everybody to be responsible at the source of where the runoff comes from, whether it's coming off the ag lands up north of the lake or south of the lake, that responsibility needs to be with those properties. Yep.
Yeah, Mark,
Yep.
I think we looked at this before the meeting. You know, we're saying that the diet, so to speak, for the lake is 105 metric tons of phosphorus. And we were clicking on this 191 basin right here. And this will show you that, you know, there's 80 tons right there. So that's, you know, you're almost at the limit just from one of these sub basins, let alone the entire watershed.
Yeah.
And that's why the whole watershed's 5 times or more higher than what it
Right.
is.
If you added
has
up
to be at
those numbers, yeah, it's
to
usually
prevent algae blooms.
500 to 600, 600, yeah. It's huge. So the loading, again, we switch from concentration to loading, but the concentration is the amount of concentration per liter. So when we say micrograms per liter or parts per billion, we're saying how many micrograms of that phosphorus is in 1 liter of water. So when you say, okay, that's how much the concentration is, but then you add the flow, you multiply that times the flow. So how many liters is flowing of that concentration, and that'll give you the load. So how many metric tons of phosphorus are entering from that watershed, sub-watershed. It's very simple, but that's the idea.
Yeah, so I mean,
concentration load. Yeah.
To put my layman's spin on this, and this is the stuff that I was trying to nail down because it was extremely frustrating to make these maps because there's no targets when it can. And I was trying to understand this relationship, kind of get concentration to flow and load.
Yeah.
So, and I'm going to put a flow load calculator on here because I had to do the math to figure these things out. So.
Yeah.
What they did to come up with that 105 ton target for Lake Okeechobee was they determined that when the lake gets above 40 parts per billion, and so that's the concentration. And so this is with this little target node thing that I was telling John about earlier. So you click on this target node. This is my cheat sheet to myself, complete with the reports and the Florida administrative code to back it up. But here's where it talks about the target for the lake was 40 parts per billion. So it's actually, like Mark said, quite simple. All you have to do is model how much water on average comes into the lake in a given year. You take that number, that volume of water, you pretty much multiply it by that concentration, you get 140 tons. Now, some of that comes directly from the sky because it falls as rainfall directly on the lake, so they back out 35. That's where you get the 105 tons. And so on average discharges into the lake, we have to have, it can't go above 40 parts per billion or we're going to have more than 105 tons. And that's how it is for all the watersheds. The Caloosahatchee has the same thing.
Yep.
The St. Lucie has the same thing, but they don't necessarily have it for phosphorus and nitrogen. That's the thing. The lake does not have it for nitrogen.
Right.
Um,
So And then it's the agencies are trying to implement the basin management action plans, which are plans for all of the owners in the watershed to reduce those levels of nitrogen or phosphorus coming off of their properties. And at the top of the list in the St. Lucie is agricultural runoff, and particularly so it's a problem. So any other questions? We can kind of get close to
This is
wrapping
John.
up right now. So
Is it possible to
I see
say,
John. Yeah, go ahead.
the simple syllogism for this is that if we reduce the amount of the inloading of the pollutant, we reduce the complexity of the problem we have to solve what to do with the water that's there.
Right.
And that's the message, it seems to me.
Yeah, we're all living downstream and we're all live in a watershed that goes downstream to somewhere. So
And it's just like a lot of other problems. It's like litter or anything else. It's a lot easier just to not litter in the first place because it costs a lot more to pick it all up. Or plastics, same thing. It's a lot easier to keep the plastics out than to try to clean all the plastics out of the water.
Yeah. Well, and
So
Todd
phosphorus
makes a
and-
good point that the treatments that they do with, like I mentioned, in peroxide or other treatments they do in marinas is just so small scale. You could never do that on a large enough scale to try to, try to treat the whole lake, for instance, or treat all of the water body. It's just, why do that when you should be treating it at the source of the pollution and get that source taken care of. So,
Yeah, this is the Pahokee Marina where they've been doing a lot of treating.
yeah.
So you'll see on some of these, it'll say post-treatment,
Which is good.
samples.
Yeah. Well, we kind of reached the end of our hour, but we're real excited that you were able to join us. We want to send out to you, so make sure we have your email, some follow-ups on these fact sheets that we have to send out. Also the presentation here, so you have the references to go to. And anything else wrapping up?
No,
Valentina?
just if there's any other questions that you think about after a presentation, you have my
Right.
email in the last slide, so feel free to send it to me. And please definitely, take action and look at that petition asking the EPA. I think that'll be really helpful once they establish, that standard. Then a lot more things have to fall in place. So yeah, just thank you
Yeah,
everyone
really
for
good.
joining, and we look forward to the next town hall in a couple of months.
Special thanks to my special guest, Todd Thurlow. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Mark and Valentina, for having me. It's fun.
All right.
Enjoy working with you all.
Everyone.
See you next time.